everyone, my name's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video we're going to paint this sort of realistic watercolor whale illustration. Now as far as painting goes, this is a pretty simple project, but I'm going to cover some advanced uses of the selection tool and show you how you can use those to your advantage. So I'm going to start out with a blank watercolor paper, and I'm going to do pretty much all the painting with the normal watercolor brush kit, and I'll put links to everything I use in the description down below. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just lower the transparency of the sketch just so I can barely see it, and then I'm going to select one of the layers underneath the paper texture. Now my whale is going to be kind of a medium, slightly desaturated blue color, and I'm going to start with the abstract round brush, and I'm going to set that brush at a pretty large size. And I'm just going to randomly fill in the outline of this whale. And I'm trying to press very lightly in some areas and harder in other areas. And this is going to create these sort of varying levels of opacity. And this is just to give our first wash here a little bit of texture. So you can see by doing that, I have some of these really light, hard edges. And it just gives it a kind of an interesting look. So after you've done that first pass, just go over it again one more time, but just in a few areas. So I'm going to go along the top. And you'll notice when I do that, it does get a little bit darker because now there's like two layers of this watercolor. And I'm going to try to focus this on areas that I want to be just a little bit darker. So along the back, also along this kind of belly line, and then along the bottom like that. Now I know it's a little bit hard to see the sketch, so I'm going to make it a little bit darker just for the sake of the video. And you can see my wash goes way outside of the boundaries of the sketch, but that's okay because I'm going to show you a really nice selection trick that's going to cut this down to match the sketch perfectly. But for now, I'm just going to blend this a little bit using the water blender tool. And I'm going to use it at a pretty big size, and I'm not going to blend all the hard edges. I'm just going to blend it in a few areas like this. There we go. So I've got a nice blending, but there's a few hard edges left behind, and that's just for kind of an interesting texture. And next, I'm going to grab the eraser tool, and I'm going to set that brush to the fine liner pen brush, and I'm going to use it at a pretty small size, maybe like 20%. And I'm going to carefully follow the sketch and just sort of cut out the whale like this. So I've cut out the main body of the whale, and I ignored the fin because we're going to add that later on a separate layer. Now I need to get rid of all this extra stuff that's going over the edge. So there's a trick I'm going to use. This is the first selection trick. I'm going to grab the selection tool, and I'm going to set it to automatic. And I'm actually just going to click and drag out here on the extra watercolor. And I'm just going to keep clicking and dragging and add as much of this to a selection as I can. Now, when it changes color and sort of has this sort of flat yellow color, that means it's been selected. So I'm going to go over to the Layers panel. And because I've selected that outer sort of extra edge, I can just tap this layer and click Clear. And it will only clear that selection. So I know that looks like a little bit of a magic trick, but all I did was I used the automatic selection to select the extra watercolor, and then I cleared it from the layer. Now what you're left with is a pretty nice edge, but unfortunately you do have this kind of hairline, it's a leftover bit from the edge of the selection. It's a really common mistake, but it doesn't happen every time. Now if you're seeing this, all you have to do actually is just do the trick again. Just click and drag, just until it's barely on the edge there. There we go. I can just see it barely taking that edge. Now watch what happens when I clear the layer again. All of that those extra little lines and extra bits, they all got deleted when I did that. Now I'm going to go back and lighten my sketch again because it's a little bit too strong. And for the next selection trick, I'm going to separate the whale into two pieces. So remember on the sketch, the whale has like the upper part of the body and then sort of the bottom of the jaw here, the chin, and there's that line that follows all the way down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the selection tool and set it to freehand, and I'm going to carefully follow that line, and I'm doing it a little bit roughly because I don't want it to be too smooth. And then I'm going to circle back around and complete that selection. So there we go. I don't know if that makes sense. I've just selected and isolated the bottom part of the whale according to the sketch. Now what I'm going to do is go to the wrench. I'm going to go to Add, and I'm going to click Cut. And what it did is it cut out that section of the layer that we selected. And now I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to go back to the wrench, and I'm going to click Paste. So basically what I've done is I've split the whale in half, and I put each half on a separate layer. So now our whale, which was on one layer, is now sort of divided onto these two layers. And just so I don't get confused, I'm going to move the bottom part so it's underneath the top part. It's just more intuitive to me, so when they're organized like that. Now next, I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to give some contrast to the top of the whale and the bottom of the whale. So I've got the bottom layer selected. I'm going to go to my hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'm going to brighten that layer just a little bit and maybe desaturate it. Now the reason I split the whale into two layers is not just because I want to lighten the bottom half. I actually want to add some shading to the upper half that doesn't affect the bottom half. So what I can do is I'm just going to go and turn off the bottom half. I'm going to select the top half. I'm going to grab the selection tool and set it to freehand. And I'm going to make a selection that just sort of covers where I want there to be a little bit of a shadow. So there we go, just following that bottom edge. I'm going to feather it out like that. I'm going to go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'm just going to darken that bottom edge just a little bit. And I'm also going to do a few more shadows. So I need to do a shadow up here at the very top sort of fin there. So I'll make a selection like that. I'm also going to feather it out, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken it a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing over here at the tail. So I've got the shading done for the top half, and now I can move on to the bottom half. So let me just turn that one on, and I'll turn off the top half for now. Now the shading on this one is a little bit different. I'm going to grab the selection tool again, but this time I'm going to select a little bit of the front and then some random areas down here. And I'll feather it out, hue, saturation, and brightness, and just darken it a little bit. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn on the top half there. And now we've got the main body of the whale sorted out here with all this shading. And now I can do the fin. So the fin is really easy. I'm just going to make sure I make a layer that's above the top and the bottom half. And I'm going to try to grab the same color as the top half. And I'm going to use the abstract round. And I'm just going to fill in that fin real quick. So it's pretty simple. I know I do have a transparency issue here, but I'm not going to worry about it now because I can fix that later on with the water blender tool. And I want to add a little bit of shading to this fin. So I'm going to grab the selection tool and just make a selection like that. Feather it out just a little bit. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And I actually want to lighten the top part of it, just like that. Now next, I want to do the sort of wrinkles on the chin. So I'm going to make a new layer above everything. And I'm just going to grab the fine liner pen, and I'm just going to quickly line those out in this light color, but I'm going to try to press sort of hard and soft, just so I have a varying line thickness. And then after that, I'm just going to go in there with the eraser and just sort of erase it wherever it sort of goes onto the top half. Now I did these wrinkles or these lines on a different layer, so I'm going to adjust the opacity, but it's hard to see because I also have the sketch. So I'm just going to disable the sketch for now, and then I'm just going to lighten it just a little bit. I don't want them to be too overstated, and I think that looks pretty good. And next I want to add the eye, and the eye is really simple. I'm just going to make another layer above everything, and I'm going to choose a sort of kind of a light desaturated blue, and I'm going to use the fine liner pen again. And the eye is right here. I'm just going to zoom in, and on a whale this size, the eye is relatively small. So I'm just going to do this simple almond shape like that. Then I'm going to grab a pretty dark color, almost black, and at a little bit of a smaller size, I'm just going to line the eye like this. And then for the pupil, I'm just going to draw a circle like that towards the top and then fill it in. But I'm just going to leave a little bit open there just as a kind of a highlight. Now my next selection trick is something I have covered in a previous video. I'm going to give all these different pieces a hard edge, and I'm going to do that with the automatic selection tool. So I'm going to start with the bottom half here. And just so it's easier to see, I'm just going to turn everything else off. And I'm going to zoom in here and grab the selection tool set to automatic. And I'm just going to click out here in the white and drag. And I want to select all the white, but not the bottom half, right? So my selection is a pretty clean edge going all along there. And I'm going to feather it out. And I'm going to feather it out just so it overlaps, maybe just about like that. Just so the feathering is just covering a little bit more of the edge there. Now I'm going to go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and watch what happens when I darken it. You can see right away that the edge of this gets a little bit darker, and this is going to give us contrast. I'm also going to saturate it a little bit, and then deselect it and zoom out here, and that's how you can get a kind of consistent hard edge along the edge of this particular element. And I'm going to go ahead and do that to the top of the whale and the fin. So there we go. I've used that trick to add a hard edge to all these different elements. And I'm going to go ahead and turn everything else back on. Next, I want to add some kind of more texture to this whale. It looks a little bit smooth. So I'm going to make a new layer sort of on top of everything. I'm going to grab the selection tool and set to freehand. And I'm just going to go along the edge here, but not perfectly. It doesn't really matter. Just kind of roughly like this. And then I'm going to feather it out just a tiny bit. And I'm going to try to select a sort of dark blue color. And I'm not going to use one of the watercolor brushes. I'm actually going to use a default brush to do this. So if you scroll down in your brush list, you can find one called spray paint. Just click flicks. And I'm just going to quickly just add some random, almost like paint splatters. You can see that kind of texture there. And I did the dark first. I'm going to go back with pure white. And I'm just going to do that in a few areas as well. Just so I've got this sort of subtle texture. And then I did it on a separate layer. So I'm just going to leave the opacity to normal, but I'm going to lower it and just raise it back up just until I can barely see it there. Now we're almost done with this one. I'm just going to merge everything together onto one layer just by pinching it together. And I'm going to go in there with the water blender brush. And I'm just going to sort of break up some of these edges that don't look quite right. So just in a few areas, I'm just going to sort of blur this a little bit. And maybe as a final step, you might want to add a highlight. And I can do that with the selection tool set to freehand. And I'll just select a line like this towards the top part of the back. And I'll feather it out just a little bit. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness and just brighten that up, just to add a little bit of a shine to the top there. And there we go. This one is all done. I know the painting process for this is pretty straightforward. The complicated part is really just the selection, kind of the selection techniques that I use. But I think if you watch this again and just sort of follow those step by step and get a little bit of practice, it'll make more sense. Now, I've recently bought a laser printer and I haven't done any videos about it yet, but I went ahead and printed this one out and it looks really good. So that pretty much wraps it up. As always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.